A friend in LA said the best way to start anything is to take off some clothes. Yeah, it's been a dizzying week, I have to say. It's 6 cities and 6 nights, so I'm still trying to figure out where I am. It was on Monday, Salt Lake City, next night, Chicago, then Boston, New York, Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. And last night, Doylestown was really, really cute. They came up and they were like, all those cities, and we made the list. I think in D.C., it's you probably look right over Doylestown. It's, you know, the capital of the nation. You're probably like, wow, Salt Lake City it's coming up. It's making the list. I would like to thank Politics and Prose. If I wanted to edit that introduction at all, it would be welcome back to Politics and Prose, because I've been coming here for almost 25 years. In 2000, I came here for House of Leaves, and it's been a long journey, and I feel very grateful. I feel grateful for bookstores in general. I always feel strange when I'm in a place where there's no bookstore. I feel like when there's something terribly wrong if you're on a street with lots of stores and there's no bookstore, or you're at a mall, or you're in Las Vegas. Something is askew, you know. And I mean that also seriously. I think one of the great things about small bookstores is that they gather minds, and minds cultivate taste. And that's where commerce does have a chance, right? Because your taste is refined. So you're not just being exposed to the same sort of junk that is decided in corporate boardrooms or bedrooms. And, you know, it's wonderful how, you know, curated everything is. Like, I always am just mesmerized. It reminds me of the Picasso quip of, I do not go out to find. I do not go out to seek. I go out to find, you know, and bookstores offer you that moment to just come across something randomly. So my thanks to the bookstore here, and to you all, because you're here at the beginning of this journey for Tom's Crossing, this new phase, and it's very exciting. We don't know really what it is. There was a young woman who was at the cash register, and I heard her say Tom's Crossing. It was the first time I'd actually heard the title, like, spoken by someone else. It wasn't me, but this title that was living out there, and that was really kind of great. We don't know what it is. You know, it's supposedly a Western, but what is a Western? Is it one book, or is it 3 books, or is it 5 books, or is it 27 little books? Or is it a brick? You know, people have been talking about it as a brick. Oh no, this is serious business. And my friend decided that he would take on this question. This was the thing that he was going to solve, and he turned to the great arbiter of truth, ChatGPT, and he said, hey, what's a brick? And it said something that weighs between 4 and 5 pounds. And so then he sent me a picture of Tom's Crossing on a scale. It was 3.1 pounds. And he wrote, all caps, first word, not a brick. So we've solved that much. You know, if you don't leave with any answers, you can at least say to yourself, yeah, but it's not a brick. And I think that kind of puzzlement is kind of, well, I guess it's the territory that I live in with all my books. That sort of question of what is a certain space, what is a place, and what is this? You know, I mean, when I started this was a reading, and I took that very seriously. I'm an author, so I will give a reading, and I will read 1 hour. That's a long time, you know. And I mean, I used to read all of the 50-Year Sword. You'd come and you actually, the publisher finally said, that's not a good idea because you've read the whole book. Why would anyone want to buy it? To reread. But then I was talking to some booksellers recently, right before the tour started, and I was like, so, you know, what's the longest reading these days? And they were like, oh, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. I was like, really? So what's the ideal time? He goes, 5 minutes. And then they said, wait a minute, 3 minutes. 3 minutes is tops. And actually, I will only be reading 2 pages tonight. But then that means that this isn't really a reading, right? I'm reading for two pages. So is this a performance? You know, in some ways, I suppose. When I do the reading, I'm going to add a little twang. So you're going to see me as actor Mark. It'll be very exciting. But the truth here, the bare bone here, is that this is all aftermath. The performance has already happened. It's all here. This is the best book I have ever written. I will never be able to write this well again. And I say that matter-of-factly, but I also say it with some melancholy, because I realized as I finished this that I had passed beyond the limits of my ability, like an athlete who finally recognizes what their muscles are capable of. Their synaptic speed has departed. And so in some ways, it's sad for me. You know, I mean, I spent 5, 6, 7 years writing this. And those first years, I was all alone. And, you know, as I started to finish it, I realized it wasn't just those years. It was a lifetime. You know, all the books that I had written prepared me for writing this. And it was a very, very special, intense journey. And in some ways, like someone who has gone on a journey, I'm now here just simply to report what that journey was like. But this is really all that matters. So if it's not a reading or a performance, what is this? I don't know. It's a gathering. Someone in Boston said it's an encounter. I thought that made me a little uneasy. I can't imagine, you know, any of you going home to your partner, your roommate, and say, hey, tonight I had an encounter. Well, maybe try it on. I don't know. Someone yesterday said, it's book talk. That's what it is, book talk. And I don't know. That sounded something like in a PowerPoint. I'd like to think there's something a little more special than just book talk, but maybe it is. Though the book isn't going to talk. It's author talk, I guess. And anyway, so in the spirit of whatever this gathering is, I would just like to lean in and, despite all the various voices that populate all my books, try to give you as frank an answer to whatever question you may have about what it's like to travel the trail of a working novelist. I've been working only as a novelist for 25 years, and the summation of what I am capable of is here. So before we get to that, I will read those promised 2 pages. And these have been vetted. I read them to my 7-year-old daughter, and she said, yay, Daddy, that's good. So I got that going for me, and it's a lot. But I should warn you, this is not a children's book. This is an adult book. It's a haunted book, in fact. And if you dare to read it, you will ride with the dead. You will ride with your own death. And there is peace to be found, but whether or not you make it is up to you. So you've been warned. Again, something my publisher would probably advise me to not say. So this is about a horse. The story of Jojo. Jojo was wild from the start, born with a hot wire in his heart. Folks admired him from foal to colt, mainly for his breeding. He was Arabian mostly, maybe with some thoroughbred, some Mustang. He had black skin more beautiful than moonlight when it's pure and unfettered by any demand to reflect, with blacker hair and white ticking. Rabicano was the best fit. He sure weren't technically, as in genetically, a true roan. Not that it mattered. Everyone who saw Jojo just saw blue. He was powerful, too, and stubborn. When he was broken, though many agree he was never broken, He never sacrificed that preserving instinct to suddenly buck and bolt for no reason anyone could explain. Because of this unpredictable quality, he was kicked around from trailers to auctions to concrete floored stalls to more trailers. And kicked around weren't just some expression. Too many folks landed kicks on his side, his flanks, and that wild creature of midnight blue took them insults and held on to them until they matured into a moment none could guess at. And then he kicked back. Jojo pretty much near kicked every wall, gate, and rib cage if he could get close enough. Now and then he'd manage a good bite, too. By the time the Gatestones got him, you couldn't even approach Jojo without him rearing straight up, which Tom thought was funny as a comic book, though even he was cautious about getting too close. Their daddy, when he first set Jojo loose in their Indian Hills paddock, named him Crescent Moon because he spent more time in the air than he did on the ground. Landry, though, called him Jojo. She and Jojo arrived at the Gatestones at pretty much the same time. This was 1973, and they was both 6. Landry had never seen a horse except in tattered storybooks. And then one day when Dallin weren't looking, little Landry slipped under the fence rail and ran to him because, as she later put it, she'd wanted to hold the moon. Tom's dad was none the wiser, neither. How could he be? It weren't like he heard anything, not a scuffle, not a bump, and sure not one of them wild neighs that typically followed that big stallion going skyward. Who can remember what Dallin was doing at that moment? But like a good parent will quick enough notice when there's nothing to notice when there's a child around, why, that's usually when trouble's in the making. Dallin didn't even think to look first to the paddock. She'd only been near his boots, near underfoot, and but a moment ago, too. And now he was frantic, heading into the barn, and when he didn't find her there, why, he was looking around the truck. He even got down on his knees. He was looking under the truck. Only when he stood back up did he look to the paddock and behold his newly adopted daughter holding that blue crescent moon. She was standing there with her arms wrapped around one leg, her head resting there too, not even tall enough to reach that horse's chest. Her eyes were closed. And do you think that big stallion was biting and kicking? Heck no. He was still as a statue. Well, that's not entirely true. Eventually, he did lower his head to sniff summer hairs, nostrils flaring maybe for the newness there. Or if you believe Charlene Kizis, who was from Orvop but wound up trying to put down roots near Edinburgh, he was catching in Landry's wild black ringlets a whiff of familiarity, of common ancestry, the spirit of goodness. Tom didn't put it like that, but he did admit that Jojo's nostrils were drinking in something no man will ever scent out. The recognition of a heart that would from that point on never leave his side, even if a grave stood between them. Clop, clop, clip, clop. Not that Dallin Gatestone the good, Dallin Gatestone the kind, Dallin Gatestone the calm could wonder any at this idol. He near lost his mind. That was one big mean horse towering over that tiny dim-witted girl. Whoa, he kept trying to huff out, already breathing too fast. Whoa, like whoa was even needed, what with the two of them not moving at all. Of course, despite his panic, Dallin weren't so foolish to go running out there either. He came in low and slow. He drew no attention. When he had about a dozen feet to go, why only then did Jojo raise his mighty head some, lifting to the leg that Landry weren't clutching, and stomping that down hard. Dallin still tried to get in closer. But again, Jojo lifted that free hoof and stomped down, this time twice. Thumps hard enough, loud enough to thump Dallin in the chest. Well, Dallin was smart enough to back off. In fact, all the way to the fence, sitting on the top rail, just praying Sandra wouldn't drive up then, because she for sure would have, well, who knows what she would have done. Fortunately, Sandra didn't come roaring in then, nor did anyone else, and Dallin just sat there and watched and waited. And only then did what he was beholding finally start to sink in. The craziest embrace he'd ever seen. One of them special moments a life only gets a handful of, if that, one you'll never forget. And Dallin sure never did forget it. And Lord knows he told the story scores of times later. though he never did share how on that day tears had welled up in his eyes and streaked his cheeks. Dallin Gatestone never could say how long that hug lasted. The way he talked about it over the years, it was like it was still going on. And maybe it was. Thank you. So that should have given you plenty of time to come up with a question. Listen to that curiosity in your mind, something that maybe is unexpected that you just want to know. Yeah, you can run. Totally cool. Oh, don't go to the mic. Oh, no, sit down. I can repeat your question. Don't worry about that. Yeah, don't line up. Just sit down. Don't worry. It's okay. We're an intimate little group here. This is like a little campfire, you know. We'll do this together. Did you have a question?
Yeah. From what I've read of the book so far, I noticed that in comparison to your previous work, it makes much less use of the, I think you called it sig-iconic style?
Signaconic, right.
There's not as many colored words, formatting alterations. Do you think that abandoning that or toning it down helped you create this book that you say is your best, or do you have some remorse in leaving it behind?
Oh, big ending there. So the question was about the typography that is, I guess, typical of my books, and more obvious. And what about this book that appears to not have it? What changed there, I guess, right? And did I feel remorse about leaving it behind? I did not feel remorse, but I did not leave it behind. The Familiar, which was a series of, it was supposed to be 27 volumes, and we got 5 volumes done. And the reality is it failed. It was a huge project. It involved translators and researchers and design assistants, and we were getting out these 880-page volumes every 6 months. Now, I should add that they were the equivalent of about 200 pages, but they explored this graphic realm. It was pushing more and more towards a graphic novel, though it was still very, very textual. And maybe it went too far. I don't know. But in the end, I felt almost more like I was a graphic designer. And so I had to sit with where I wanted to go next. And one of the things that was clear was that there had been so many people on this project that I wanted to return to something that I was going to do alone. And so that's where I started with Tom's Crossing. But the fact is I still designed this book. As I was writing it, the design changed. The way it fit on the page changed. As the voice that inhabits this book began to sort of possess the book, possess me in a way, it dictated what the book was going to look like. So it's completely fair to pick that up and go, wow, this is so weird. And people have said that. I mean, I guess it's a compliment to me if someone picks up a book and it looks normal and they think because I wrote it, it's really weird. So that's an achievement. The reality is, though, that it's still been very carefully typeset. Like where the pages break, where line breaks, where words, in jam, all of that I was paying attention to. So that is kind of the weird thing. Like generally when you read a book, you're reading what an algorithm is flowing through the text boxes. Not this book. It is designed to look like the mountain it is. You have to climb that mountain. And the next handhold isn't necessarily going to be on the bottom of the page. You're going to have to reach up to that next page to get there. And sometimes it's going to be easy. And then sometimes because of the syntax, like a very, very complex climbing route, it will become very, very difficult. And when you look at it, it's just not obvious. So that's just something to bear in mind. I will say, I'm an explorer, so I don't know how effective that is. It's just something I believe. I believe that form and structure do bring around new revelations, and that's why I pay that kind of attention. But there's one way to test it, which is the electronic book will reflow all the text. It'll keep some of the major breaks, but everything that I'm talking about in terms of page breaks and line breaks, it will override. So just read both versions and then tell me your opinion. Yes.
I really enjoyed the introduction you wrote to Gaston Alashard's Poetics of Space, and I'm curious how you see that work influencing the stuff you wrote after House of Leaves.
So the question was about an introduction that I wrote about Bachelard's Poetics of Space. And that was an early book. I remember when I was working on, an early book that I'd read, I was working on House of Leaves. And as I was discussing some of the ideas that were coming up more and more about space and how we inhabit it, and how space changes, someone in a loft in New York City recommended that I read this book. And I did, and I loved it. And then many, many, many years later, I was asked to write this introduction, and it was a real pleasure. And if you pick it up, it's just a couple of pages, and there is some sort of typographic madness there, but Bachelard would have been in favor of, for sure. How that influenced my later works is complicated. I guess the simplest through line is that House of Leaves interrogates its influences as much as it can. If you read it closely, it will provide you with all the books that I was reading, and more books. So you can actually look to the book to find the documentation of the book's creation. Only Revolutions begins to sort of spread out. Yes, you can read the Romantic poets. You can read Whitman and Wordsworth. And then you can begin to sort of understand, the romanticism of ecology and the politics of this country, and et cetera, et cetera. But it always seems that as much as I keep learning, I'm also moving outward, at least. And so the familiar was then it went beyond even primary documents. It went to trips to Singapore, for example, to actually talk to people and learn Singlish over there. It meant taking cab rides over and over with Armenian cab drivers in Los Angeles to understand how they spoke and what, some of the sort of nuances and stories, of those lives that were not mine. And so at a certain point, like a large language model, in a way, it's very hard to track exactly where Tom's Crossing comes from. I mean, Tom's Crossing is an aggregate of what I would call the holy trinity of any artist, which is learning, experience, and imagination. And when those come together, they offer you something that goes beyond the obvious sources. And so that was the space that I ultimately, inhabited, I guess, lived in. Yes.
I'm really curious about the narrator of Tom's Crossing. So just the sort of few pages that I've read seems to combine both the kind of omniscience and also is like a character in the world. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, what can you say about the narrator? How did you alight on this particular voice?
So the question was about the narrator and where did that voice come from? Right from the beginning, it is a little perplexing, well observed, well read, that it seems part of the world and yet also retains a kind of omniscient perspective. There's a lot there, and I think it would be a spoiler to say anything more specific. I think you should enjoy the book and know the question of who the narrator is very important. And how one, attains those vantage points is also important. I will say from my part though, and this is kind of going back again to the typographical question, is like, when I started this, it was there was a voice. And I've likened it to like the voice of the forest. And I'm talking a very open forest of birches and aspens with just beautiful paper bark and sparkly gold leaves. And it was like, Mark, write this thing. Just come in a little further. Okay, it's going to be a novella. It's going to be very, very short. You're going to write it very, very quickly. Your publisher's going to be so happy. It'll be easy. When a voice that doesn't have a body tells you it's going to be easy, you're already in trouble. But it was like, come on a little further. So I kept writing, right? And as you can imagine, I didn't see this wonderful meadow and lake, and the forest got more dense. And soon I was like on the side of a steep hill that was heading up into the mountains. And it was a much different voice. It was the voice of the mountain, or it was the voice of something else. And I will say this, it's what I waited a lifetime for. I'm very lucky, but it inhabited me. And in many ways, I was the servant to this voice. And that's when the pandemic hit. And it is one thing that I like to say to whomever I'm talking to, that we do need to keep talking about the pandemic. It was this incredible global experience that we all had, and it was so private, and it was so isolating, and we all did weird things, and yet we've kind of emerged from it, and lives were lost. We lost friends. We lost touch with friends. Still can't believe we were taking little bottles of alcohol, spraying the boxes on our stoop, and yet there's like no monuments, or there's no, we almost don't believe it happened, right? And so talk about it. Don't forget it when you're with your friends. This is a side note. This has nothing to do with Tom's Crossing. Just say, hey, you remember that? Like, what were you doing? Like, let people talk about it. It's like, find out, I will say, though, writers are made for pandemics. I just went up to my office and sat at my desk, and I was far away on that mountain with these kids and these horses. And this voice became more and more material. And then it restructured the typography. The density became apparent, the font that I was using, even the sort of the syntax, as you will note. I mean, these are long, languorous sentences, but there's something weird about them. And I've discovered their weirdness because we're doing the audiobook right now, which I can get to in a second. But they go beyond human breath. Right? It's like a liquid voice. Like, it sounds familiar. It sounds human, and yet at the same time, it has like the lungs of the wind. And you start to realize like, oh, wow, this isn't quite right. And that was very, very evident when we started working on the audiobook. Penguin Random House, Audio, I admire their optimism. They reached out to me like a month and a half before on sale date, October 28th. And they were like, hey, we want to do this as an audiobook. I said, great. And we're going to release it on October 28th when the book comes out. I was like, excuse me? Don't worry, we're professionals. And I said, well, how long do you think it's going to take? And they said, well, you can do like a YA book in 3 days, 3 recording days. And those are long days. So we just finished our 14th day, and we made halfway. So we have a ways to go. But I have incredible actor, incredible co-director, engineer, and the days are long. I mean, it's a long recording process. But what you discover is that there is this kind of strangeness to the voice, because you almost can't do it. You almost can't. You can't read all the sentences. It's a profound experience, and I imagine your mind will inhabit that as you read it. But you'll also sense what you sense. Like, where does this come from? Yes.
Yeah.
I'll get you next. I saw his hand appear behind the pillar.
Sorry. So you had your child about 7 years ago. Actually had mine around the same time, my first child. And one thing I've noticed is that like every few months, there's a wild shift in my perspective of the entire universe based on what this child is up to in life and the things he says, and my younger children as well. I'm assuming you can relate to that somewhat. And what I'm curious is how those shifts and new things and new experiences of parenthood shaped the book, which was developing along the same timeline as your child, and also maybe more broadly than the book, which contains children in it. And even in that like section that you read, there's some familiarity as a parent that I could relate to. But yeah, just sort of how parenthood influenced the book or changed the book, and maybe life in general.
Sure. So it was dad talk. We both have a young child, and the question was how did that influence the book? Well, obviously it did, right? But anyone who's a parent knows it's just, having a child is a catastrophic event. I mean, it is the worst possible experience. And if no one has told you this, then I'm here to tell you, okay? Having a child is awful. It's amazing that we survive. It is amazing that this biological prerogative moves us forward. And my wife and I were furious at all our friends for the first 6 months. We were just like, you didn't tell us how terrible it is. I mean, this is like, you are not my friend anymore. Of course, as I'm saying that, there's this profound love that emerges. And you are entirely devoted and captivated by this fragile life that has emerged. And the awful part is just that the hell of being a parent just never quite equals out the love of being a parent. It's like this double helix of heaven and hell. But therein lies this, extraordinary mystery. And I think the hardest part about it is that, and I think for me, this was, in the end, I could take the lack of sleep, I could take this lovely being the mind chatter. Like I always had the luxury of being able to entertain a thought for minutes. I could be like, oh, this. And now it's like, daddy. And it's like a shattered piece of glass just collapses and you can't even remember where you are. But I think the hardest thing for a parent, and parents all know this, is that when your child is born, death enters with your child. It's this terrible fear, like the newborn, like, is she going to make it through the night? Like, will she be there? Will I be that story? Will I lose my child at 2? Will she fall into a swimming pool? Like all of those things. And you keep thinking you're going to get past it. Oh, now she can walk. Now she knows how to swim. And it never leaves. Francis Bacon has this wonderful quote that says, death is our friend, and those who do not entertain death are never at home. And I think that was a big one. It's like learning how to set a place for death. And I think death does inhabit this book. And that was a big surprise. I didn't realize how death would become a presence in Tom's Crossing. But in a way that in this jocular way that I described parenting, what I think it also achieves is that at the same time that death walks along on this journey, by making death's acquaintance, the vividness and the beauty of life is allowed to take its place too. And in that way, I think that's what, being a parent certainly has helped me see, is that, it's like the fragility, the anxiety, the fear, that's not going to go away. So stop, make your peace with that, and then enjoy the laughter and the play and the humor and the jokes and seeing life evolve. And as you watch it bloom, you see it everywhere. Oh yes, behind the pole.
In seeing that it's specifically Western
Mhm.
in the very first pages. I feel like across a lot of media that I've seen, movies, books, and TV and all that, the definitions that people have for Westerns can vary a lot. Some people are very strict, and some people are very open on what is and isn't a Western. I was curious kind of what your definition of that is, and when you sat down and first start the book, were you saying from the get-go, I'm going to write a Western, or to kind of develop into that along the way?
So the question is about its, I guess, subtitle of that Tom's Crossing is a Western, and what does that mean? Because some writers are very strict about the genre, and other writers are less strict, I suppose. I guess I never start writing anything in terms of genre ever, even though House of Leaves is considered a horror book. I never wrote it with that in mind. I was writing about a family that lived in this house. This book started very simply. It's about two kids who become friends at a corral where there's two neglected horses. I didn't know, like I was telling you in that story of the voice that led me into the woods and then up onto the mountain, what it was going to become. And despite it appearing not to be typeset, the title page is very typeset. It has multiple fonts. It has a word that is struck out, a name that's struck out, and it has a Western, and it's in a bright font, and it's the kind of font that you could imagine being kind of branded on a piece of leather, right? And that's kind of giving you an alert, like, what is a Western? And, I was born in New York City, and then when I was 9, in the summer of 1975, we moved to Provo, Utah. And I had never written about Utah. I lived there until I was 18. I don't even know why. But I was unable, maybe I felt afraid to, I felt unworthy of the experience there. And in that moment after The Familiar didn't work, writing alone, I felt like, okay, I'm going to address what this is, right? And when we moved, we were taking a west turn, forgive me, it just came to me. But we headed west, and all the stories of the West were there. And all the stories of the West were still alive there. I mean, we played cowboys and Indians, all the things that are, that would make our skin crawl now in a way. That's what we were doing. But kids have this wonderful sort of feral way of reenacting these stories because I wanted to be Geronimo, right? It wasn't that you had to align with the John Wayne figure as you were playing on those dusty, dirty hills. You were kind of captivated by the entire relationship of it, the dynamics. And inherently, the children understood that there had always been people there. Because the great Western myth, right, is that you can just go grab land. It's free. It's open. I go out there and it's mine. It's one of the great blinding, imperial notions, right, that nothing is there unless I'm there. And when I'm there, then it's mine. But kids aren't processing it like that. So you're telling these stories which the culture is kind of trying to cement in your mind to justify everything that has since taken place. And so one of the stories was about Squaw Peak. It's since been renamed, but it is the peak that overlooks Utah Valley there. And the story was always that there was a young woman from, we don't know what tribe, Ute, Shoshone, who was being pursued by the pioneers or the militia. And rather than submit, she threw herself off the mountain. So here's the story we told, which was almost a ghost story, right? Because the squaw, a derogatory name, overlooks the valley, overlooks the canyon, and haunts it. And the kids, without really understanding what that is, by carrying forward this story, by retelling it over and over, they are pointing a finger at sort of the parental, societal structure by saying, wait, you were the ones who was pursuing her. up the mountains. And she is this kind of hero. And one of the things that happens in the book is I could never forget her. So I didn't want to leave her. And so the book doesn't take place in Provo, Utah. It takes place in Orvop, Utah. And who that woman is within that sort of structure is different. But I thought it was time for her to have a name. And I thought it was time to meet her. And that was something that, again, that was unexpected for me. And so, believe it or not, that is my answer to the Western, is that it's sort of, the Western is destabilized as to the myth making, you know, that is kind of like part of that genre. It's like, is it a Western or is it something else? Is it a, to use a fancy word, is it a deconstruction of Western? And by the way, the word deconstruction, I just have to, and does not mean disassemble. Like we often use it. Oh, they're deconstructing something to it means, you know, we're taking it apart. No, disassemble is something very different. Deconstruction actually means that you destabilize the word, that you recognize that, like, as the screes, if you're willing to cross them in this book, they aren't necessarily sure footing. And then what does the world mean if things are giving way, if you can't step somewhere or say something without the word collapsing underneath? Yes.
So I've gone through the crossing, and
You've read the whole thing? Oh, wow.
I blame you for writing a really great novel.
Hold on. Take note, okay? He comes to class, he's prepared, compliments me, he says, I wrote a great book, he's read the whole thing, so whatever he wants to know, I have to tell him.
I mean, I will spare anybody. I've been trying to figure out how to ask a question without giving away anything. And so the best way I want to try and ask the question is, in writing the work, did you feel that the sort of spell that the narrator has over the reader changes as the spirit or the voice, the spell goes through the crossing itself? And
So does the voice change by the end? Is that what you're saying?
that the spell that's kind of over you changes. So my personal experience was in the very beginning, I couldn't put it down. I was seduced. And then there's a very specific point, obviously you know probably which that is, that all of a sudden my speeding read, the reading speed that I have just stopped. And it kind of came to a standstill, and I was breathing for the first time once that point happened.
And so you're asking how much control did I have over how you experienced
that, and
the
sort of
book?
if you intended for that whole to change after certain events unfold.
So the question is, like, how much control, how much intention was there in, this is slightly reductive, but in the pacing of the narrative voice, you know, so that you are, you know, you're moving faster and faster, or you want to get from page to page, and then at a certain point you want to pause. You know, I didn't write something or write down what I was listening to manipulate the reader's experience. It was my experience. The material itself presents a tempo. And that was the thing that was so surprising to me, was the tempo. You know, it wasn't as fast as I thought it was going to be, you know, and yet at the same time it was extremely propulsive. And yeah, I don't know. All I can say is the voice was its own, and it took hold of me as well. And then in the end, it let go, you know. And yeah,
I think it's that let go part when the voice finally dies.
yeah. And the let go is is important. I mean, one of the things that has surprised me recently is people who have read it, and I would recommend, by the way, taking your time. I don't think it's a book to read quickly. Like if you really are set on making this journey, you can't read it quickly. You can't speed read this book. That's like you didn't climb the mountain, you just flew a plane over it and say, I got it, I did it, done, Everest underneath me. You have to spend time with it and you will be rewarded. And my recommendation is just read a few pages a day. Take your time, I mean, I'll give you one example of an exceptional reader. When this book went through 10 drafts to give you an idea. So it was a long process. And these drafts were not just polishes or I read it through quickly for commas. Like the first draft was very different. I mean, the second draft was very different from the first draft. These were big changes that were taking place. And by the time I got to the seventh draft, I was, well, first my wife was the first reader, and that was a very important moment because she had been living with someone who for years was not sharing what he was writing. And so she was concerned. She's like, what is this going to be about? And I seriously did contemplate printing up 500 pages that just said all work and no play makes Mark a dull dude. But I didn't. And, when she finished, I saw tears in her eyes and she said, it's a banger. And that was the first review that I got. It's a banger. I actually should make a plaque somewhere and be like, okay, that was the summation. And that did help. And then the next person to get to read it, number 2, was my editor. And the draft that I had finished was 1,800 pages long. And I thought I was being extremely generous to cut it down to 1,600 pages. So he and I then worked to cut 400 pages out of the book. I can tell you that is a lot of work for an editor. And then he told me very gently, he said, I think we need to make what's called a pre-galley. If those of you who don't know what a galley is, it's an early version. It's about 6 months off of when it goes on sale. It's all paper, but it has the cover and it has a little sort of spiel about the marketing plan, et cetera. And you give it to potential reviewers so that they have time with the book. But we decided to make a pre-galley, and we only made about 20. And it just came in brown paper. And we picked, I think it was 18 amazing writers. And some of them very famous, some of them had only written the first novel, but they were very meaningful to me. And I wrote a handwritten letter. And this, by the way, is interesting, I think, for writers out there, because I got to tell you, looking for an endorsement or a blurb is hard work, even if you've written already close to 10 books. It is never easy. So I wrote this handwritten letter. We wrapped it in burlap. The thing had about 12,000 errors that I had to still correct, and I was uncomfortable with giving it out, but whatever. We had like faux straw around it. We put it in this box, and we sent it out. And I didn't hear from anyone, no one. And in the middle of the summer, I get a postcard, a handwritten postcard. Mr. D, the story is very good. The language is luxe, but it's slow going. I'm only 300 pages in, but I like it a lot. Steve. And I took this to my wife and I was like, who the hell is Steve? And it was Stephen King. And then we didn't hear anything. And it was like a Larry David bit. It's sort of like, well, is he writing a blurb? Is this, but no, it doesn't count. It doesn't count. A blurb is something official. You have to go to the publisher. You have to give permission because they're going to print it on the back. And we're like, maybe this was his way of saying, no, I'm not going to read it. But sure enough, months later, a blurb arrives. It's amazing. and a real inspiration, I have to say. This guy was writing, he writes so much, he's involved in so many productions, and yet he still took the time to read this book and write a lot about it. And so it's very moving to me, and it also makes me feel inadequate because I realize I have to work harder on the galleys that come my way because that's part of it. But he wrote me an email afterwards, and he said that he had read every single word. He wanted me to know. He said, I read every single word, and it took me 3 or 4 months to read. So I figure that's a good medium. Like, you know, you shouldn't think about 3 weeks. You should think about months. And one of the practices that I've had over the last 5 years is to read big books. But I read them along other books, but I read them at night. And I only read 3 or 4 pages. But I read them every single night. I read 3 pages. Sometimes it's only 1, but it's never more than 5. I have a little book light so it doesn't disturb my wife. I've been able to read the Iliad, the Divine Comedy, Magic Mountain, Lonesome Dove, all the big ones. And it's been such a great experience. And I think that would be the ideal experience, that every night you just read a few pages and you slowly go up that mountain with those horses. I promise you, you'll be rewarded.
I also found it pretty interesting for your choice of characters with having children, and also insightful in your top-down perspective as like a father and having children, like the specter of death always being there. So my question has to do with kind of more bottom up, and like was like the traits of like innocence, or maybe like the loss of innocence, like important to like your like the book and like process and everything.
So the question was, acknowledging the presence of parents and children, but with an emphasis on that understanding of innocence and loss of innocence. I mean, I definitely think it's factored in the same way that the conversation we just had about the Western. There's implied in the Western, right, a kind of paradise, right? It's the untouched land, and Innocence has the same kind of thing. But, as a parent, I can tell you that doesn't exist. Children are immediately exposed, buffeted, aided by, all sorts of, moments. But it's certainly something that's looked at, those kind of preternatural gifts that can arrive, and, having been around kids a lot more, you can see kids do really dumb things. But you see adults do it all the time too, so that's no exception. And then you can also, be lucky enough to experience those moments where they go beyond themselves. And maybe that's how I would look at childhood innocence now. It becomes a little harder as you get older. Not that you're not capable of it, but we've all kind of confined ourselves within certain habits and routines and whatnot. And do we know how far we can go? Do we know how far we can reach? And in many ways, this is the book. Because this book, why I'm so proud of this book, is it reaches beyond anything that I could write. I went beyond my limits. But it's also kind of amazing to see a child also suddenly demonstrate something that is far beyond what their abilities, of what you thought they were. It's like suddenly they have obtained an aptitude and they almost don't seem to be themselves. And it happens on, all levels. They suddenly walk and run in a way that's particularly agile, right? And maybe it doesn't last. Or in a classroom, someone who's never made really great observations suddenly constructs a thought with 6 parts that's kind of really exciting. Like my daughter and I were walking to school and she goes, "Daddy, you know how flies get caught in spider webs?" And I was like, yeah. She goes, "Do you think the spider sees the web right before it's caught? Or is it just caught? Like, is it aware that the web is coming up?" I mean, she was 6 when she asked me that. I did not answer like, "Yeah, that's how we are. We don't know. Is the web right there? Are we running into it? Am I flying into it right now?" So it was just kind of one of those stunning questions. And, Yes.
I want to touch on a couple of things you said that stood out to me. you said that the pandemic was great for writers, and you talked a lot about following this voice wherever it went. And I'm an aspiring writer, but also have a day job. The pandemic was absolutely terrible for me. And you touched on this a little when you talked about parenting and being distracted by your kid when you're trying to follow a thought. But I'm wondering what advice you would have about following a voice even when you have these other responsibilities.
So the question was, I'm going to come back to this, came from someone who describes themselves as an aspiring writer. And I'm going to ask you what that means in a second, right? And so and pointed out fairly that the pandemic was not a good time, which is completely understandable. You know, I mean, it doesn't always work. I mean, there were just terrible stories about living conditions and what you were capable of doing or whatnot. And life intrudes. Your children shatter your thoughts. You know, the bills have to be paid. You know, you have to take the garbage out, chop wood, carry water, right? And so how do you do that? So I guess the question I want to just, in terms of refinement, when you say you're an aspiring writer, are you writing?
Yes.
Because that's all that matters. You're not an aspiring writer. You're a writer. An aspiring writer is someone who looks at the desk and the piece of paper and goes, one day I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a word on it, you know? That's an aspiring writer. A writer is someone who writes. And this is probably a sort of good way to sort of end, but you know, I had a lovely experience in Boston. There was a young student, couldn't have been more than 15, and he asked me, he says, well, what do you do about that inner saboteur, right? The one who's getting in the way of you writing, right? And by the way, we are talking about writers, but it applies to anyone. Anyone who's an artist or even has that creative impulse to change what their profession is, right? And I thought about it and I was like, well, you know, this has been framed as your inner critic, right? You know, but the way he said saboteur, it had such wonderful texture, and I was kind of thinking about it, and so I said, and this was kind of a moment of inspiration in a way that was because of him. But I was like, it's because your inner saboteur has written more than you've written. And as you become more advanced, your inner cheerleader may have written more than you have. So there's a Buddhist koan when, you know, someone comes up and says, hey, I'm having really a hard time meditating. Any advice? Yes, meditate another 30 years, right? The idea is that forget about like writing just enough today or tomorrow. Think about it in terms of decades. You want to write way more than your inner saboteur, than your inner cheerleader. You want to write so much that it goes beyond all those voices so they don't matter. So when I was writing, I didn't hear anything. You know, I literally, those voices, all it was is like, wow, you know, Kalen and Tom and Navidad and Mouse and the specificity of where they lived. And the irony, of course, of all of this, which I think we all understand, is that it's a work of fiction. Like, that's kind of weird. It's all made up. I mean, sometimes when someone asks me what I do, I just say I make things up, which is true. But, you know, the artist always talks about, like, I want to reach the truth. And yet they do it by making something up. What is that? So I'm going to end with this. And I'm going to end with it in this bookstore because it is so important. And it's my belief. I invite you to challenge it on your own time. But I want to talk about very quickly the importance of fiction, of made up things. Because when you read nonfiction, you're constantly aware that there are real people out there. There are real events that you can kind of approach differently through different news sources. You could theoretically call up the principal people and talk to them, you know. And in a weird way, your mind rests a little. We all kind of, whether it's accurate or not, we're like, okay, well, Pearl Harbor really is over there, or, you know, whatever, White House is over there. You know, you kind of all know it. But when you read a work of fiction, it requires your entire imagination to work. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's a Western, it's made up, and you know that from the beginning. And so as you use your imagination, guess what happens to your imagination? It gets stronger. And you read more, and your imagination gets stronger and stronger. And you start reading harder books, it gets still stronger. So where is that moral leap? Well, where does empathy come from? How do we consider others, other people, our environment? How do we get into their shoes, see through their eyes? What do we need categorically? Imagination. If you have no imagination, you cannot care about anyone other than yourself. So I say read fiction, strengthen your imagination, and you will find already moral purpose in the world. Thank you very much.